Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Woods, the Executive Director of Alumni Relations at Marist College and a graduate from the class of 1997. We're very excited to present this webinar to you today featuring two of Marist's prominent historians. Before I introduce them, I'd like to point out a few features of WebEx. If you encounter audio issues, you do have the option to dial in by telephone. I have provided that number and code in the chat box. Due to the number of participants, we have muted all lines except for the presenters. We're going to reserve the chat option for any technical questions you have or general questions for the Marist staff. Please do not send private messages to Dr. Woolner or Colonel Johnson, as they will not be monitoring those messages. Please use the Q&A feature if you have questions for them and send them directly to the host so the Marist staff can monitor those questions. Thank you. There will be a brief survey on your screen at the conclusion of the webinar with 5 questions. So if you have a minute, we would really appreciate your feedback. As you can imagine, we're doing a lot of web events now, so we'd like to know how we're doing and how we can do them better. So now I'd like to tell you about our presenters. Dr. David Woolner is a senior fellow and resident historian of the Roosevelt Institute, professor of history at Marist College, and senior fellow of the Center for Civic Engagement at Bard College. He is the author of The Last 100 Days, FDR at War and Peace, published in 2017, and is editor or co-editor of 5 books. He has participated in interviews with CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, the History Channel, NPR, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He has served as historical advisor to the Ken Burns film, The Roosevelts, An Intimate History, as well as several other productions. He also advised numerous special exhibitions at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. He sits on the editorial board of the International History Review, is a member of the advisory group to the Churchill Archives Project, and is the series editor for the Palgrave Macmillan series, The World of the Roosevelts.
Thank you, Amy.
Dr. James M. Johnson continues to serve as the Executive Director of the Hudson River Valley Institute and the Dr. Frank T. Bumpus Chair in Hudson River Valley History at Marist College, where he taught history from 2000 to 2018. He is the author of Militia, Rangers, and Redcoats, co-compiler of America's First River, and the co-editor of Key to the Northern Country, the Hudson River Valley in the American Revolution. Dr. Johnson graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1969, where he later taught military history for 15 years. Duke awarded him a Master of Arts in History in 1977 and a PhD in History in 1980. He received a second Master of Arts degree in National Security and Strategic Studies from the Naval War College in 1995. He served for 30 years in the United States Army, retiring as a colonel. Dr. Woolner and Colonel Johnson, thank you in advance for spending time with all of us today and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you, Amy. It's a delight to be here today.
Yes, thank you very much, Amy. Hello from the 1780s Horton House in Blooming Grove. It will surprise nobody who knows me that I'm looking at General Washington directly across from me above Professor Woolner. As is also clear to most of you, I'm not Dr. Tom Wehrmuth. The VPAA called me out of the bullpen as he, President Dennis Murray, the Board of Trustees, and the Cabinet are manning the citadel of Greystone and the ramparts of Hancock 24/7, meeting the challenges of these trying times. From my perspective, it's great to have the ambassador, Professor Woolner, and the colonel, that's me, together today on this virtual stage. The War Department meets the State Department. Welcome to all of you who are watching today with a salute to our former students and interns. I'd also like to render a special salute to a participant in the events of the last 100 days in the Pacific, Captain Bern Handel, U.S. Army, retired. His wife Shirley serves on HRVI's advisory board. I salute you, Captain Handel. Thank you for what you did. Huzzah. This opportunity to discuss Franklin Delano Roosevelt's last 100 days made me reflect on how much the members of my Hudson River Valley history class, many of whom would go on to teach special education, enjoyed their field trip to the Wallace Center and Springwood. They were impressed by FDR's willpower and his accomplishments as he overcame the ravages of polio. This also inspired me to take the time to examine my parents' military records to see where they were during this time. This is my father, Captain Cecil E. Johnson, and my mother, Lieutenant Margaret Ellen Keepin Johnson. On 12 April, my dad, Captain Cecil E. Johnson, was leading his Fox Company 335 Infantry, 84th Division, to link up with Soviet troops on the Elba River. My mom, Margaret Keepin, was an Army nurse in the 113th General Hospital in Awaz, Iran, Persia, when FDR was in Tehran. They met later in 1945 in Rhein-Neckar, Germany, where my mom's 26th Field Artillery Hospital was. Thanks, David, for such an inspiration. As our franchise historian takes the mound, baseball's on hold now, I would like to point out that he and his book have regained celebrity, so you'll be able to see him again on an upcoming CBS Sunday morning show. Stay tuned. So, Professor Woolner, let's start with the obligatory opening question. Why did you write this book, and why did you focus on the last 100 days of FDR's presidency?
Thank you, Colonel. It's a delight to be here. I hope we can take this show on the road someday. And thanks to Marist and Professor Wehrmuth and Amy Woods and all for the invitation to speak with you today. I'm thoroughly enjoying this. I wrote this book because, I've always been a great admirer of FDR. And of course, he's famous for his first 100 days. And, thinking a little bit about the end of his life and going over a lot of the medical history and so forth, I started to think about, why did he run for this last term? And I suddenly came up with this notion that I should write a book on the last 100 days. And as it turns out, most people don't realize this, but a bit of luck on my part. The 100 days actually refers not to the 100 days of FDR's first term in presidency, his time in actual office. It refers to the first 100 days of Congress being in session. I was kind of nervously counting back from April 12th, and as it turns out, January 3rd was the opening session of Congress, and the gavel came down at 12 noon on January 3rd, which is 1 o'clock in Georgia at wartime. So almost exactly to the minute, 100 days later after Congress opened, Roosevelt died. So the title of the book is actually quite accurate from that perspective. But the idea was, he's so famous for his last 100 days, or his first 100 days, maybe I should focus on the last 100. And it just sort of stuck, and I ran with it, and it turned out to work out very well.
In your chapter 1, which is entitled An Uncertain New Year, since we're in the new year in 1945, perhaps you might expand on this. Why did you call it that? Why was this an uncertain new year?
Well, again, going back to sort of one of the reasons I wrote the book, thinking a lot about why, Roosevelt's determination to run for a fourth term, even though he was really quite exhausted. His determination really to finish and see the war through to conclusion. But one of the things that really struck me is just how things were not settled. We have a tendency to think that by the end of December 1944, the war is all but won. But in fact, when you look at what was happening, the Ardennes offensive in the mid-December, the highest casualty rates of the U.S. Army in Europe in December of 1944, the tremendous worry over what was happening in Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, with the Soviet Union sending all kinds of signals that they were going to dominate Eastern Poland, or Poland. And equally important, British intervention in Greece. Most Americans aren't aware of this, but once the Nazis withdrew from Greece in the fall of '44, the Greek resistance to the Nazis was largely communist, and they wanted a full role in the provisional government that emerged after the Nazis left. And the British were very opposed to this, and they wanted to set up a kind of conservative monarchist regime. And they actually ended up intervening in Greece and sending troops into Greece to put down a kind of communist assertion of political power. In fact, there's a demonstration that took place in Athens on the 3rd of December 1944, where 48 people were killed, fired on by Greek police and British soldiers. So this was all being written up in the U.S. press, and people were beginning to ask, what are we fighting for? Are we fighting for British imperialism and the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe? And then there was this curious newspaper article came out right about the same time that the Atlantic Charter had never been signed. It was just kind of a press release, and there was this sort of 48-hour speculation. Well, does this mean the charter really isn't valid, and so forth? So there was a lot of uncertainty about what was actually going to happen. And in Congress, the congressmen were saying, this may be the most difficult Congress that we've had in decades in terms of bringing the war to a conclusion. And of course, most importantly, as you know, as a military man, we weren't even in Germany yet. I mean, the war was by no means over.
So buried in what you just said is this notion that FDR had decided to run for a fourth term in 1944. What do you think of that? I mean, what was he really trying to achieve at this point?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one that I go into somewhat at length, both at the beginning of the book and then at the end. It's an interesting story. He clearly was a man of ill health, and I think one of the more fascinating parts of the book is my description near the end when Eleanor Roosevelt's talking to a friend of hers by the name of Mrs. Ferryweather, who they're sort of talking about FDR's health, and Eleanor admits that he's really declined. But she said, he knew that running for office might shorten his life, and she was actually talking about the 1940 election, not the 1944 election. And she said, but he decided to do it anyway. He wanted to finish the work that he'd started, and I agree with him. So I think he was aware of his mortality, although obviously he wasn't expecting to succumb and die suddenly. But I think he really felt this overwhelming responsibility, a sense of responsibility to see the war through and to get the United Nations established.
That sound like two really important reasons to carry on despite his health. One of the things that struck me, and this strikes me every time I walk into the Wallace Center, the Henry Wallace Center, near the FDR Presidential Library, that for that last election, he replaced Henry Wallace with a very important guy by the name of Truman. Why did he do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. This also goes back to 1940, when the war had broken out and Roosevelt was contemplating a third term. And it's interesting, the third term election was actually much more controversial than the fourth term. The third term was unprecedented. No president since had ever done this before. He violated Washington's maxim not to run for a third term. And so that one was very controversial. And of course, there was also this expectation or this fear that the war was going to bring an end to all the kind of New Deal reform ideas and so forth. And once again, he was talking to James Farley in the summer of 1940, and he said, Roosevelt said, a man like me could drop dead at any moment. And it's really the only time that he really paid attention to his vice president. And I think it was because he was concerned about if he dropped dead, what was going to happen to the New Deal. And Wallace was probably the most ardent New Dealer in the entire cabinet, probably the most left-wing. Although being left-wing and supporting the New Deal are not necessarily the same thing. I should make that point. But by 44, Wallace was a bit of an outlier. He wasn't, originally was a liberal Republican. He eventually switched over to the Democratic Party after serving in the administration for a while in the 30s as Secretary of Agriculture. But the party bosses at the Democratic Party never liked him. And they basically coalesced around Roosevelt and said, you've got to pick somebody else. Roosevelt never publicly admitted this. He publicly said he supported Wallace being on the ticket. But party bosses orchestrated this sort of coup for Truman, which Roosevelt went along with. And I also think it was important to him because he didn't want a political controversy in 44. You know, he's really hoping to get the United Nations established. And Wallace's reputation as being too far to the left made him somewhat of a controversial figure in both in the Democratic and the conservative Republican wing of the Republican Party. So I think Roosevelt, you know, he didn't want to make that fight, and so he went along with Truman.
I think it's interesting that he did pick former Captain Harry Truman, who commanded a field artillery battery in World War I that probably helped when things were thrown in his lap after FDR died. A very interesting twist of history here in terms of someone's preparation to be president, particularly having to make a decision on the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
So if you look at the timeline of the major events of 1945, the last 100 days, the Yalta Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin in Crimea in February appears to be the most significant and personally time-consuming for FDR. I calculated that he was gone from the U.S. for 37 days in order to do what he did at Malta, at Yalta, and then in Egypt on his way back. So 330 people joined FDR in the Crimea. Just to show you how well prepared the Brits always are, Churchill's mission included 144 bottles of whiskey and, apropos to today, 100 rolls of toilet paper. In total, the British transported over 1,532 bottles of all kinds of alcohol. This was quite a logistical undertaking. And then the political significance of this are really hard to even think about. So what do you think about this journey and what happened at Yalta?
Well, you know, one of the things that I really enjoyed writing about was the journey to Yalta. Logistically, it's an extraordinary story. You know, the traversing the Atlantic when it was still infested with U-boats, particularly going through the Strait of Gibraltar, was very risky. Then the flight from Malta to the Crimean Peninsula, the Saki airfield, of course, a 1,400-mile flight with the Germans still in possession of the island of Crete and still able to send up fighter aircraft. So they had to avoid all of that. They even stationed naval rescue ships all along the air route just in case something happened. And it was the first time the president flew in what was called the Sacred Cow. This was the Air Force One, the first actual presidential plane, which Roosevelt was very embarrassed by because they built an elevator underneath the fuselage that could lift up his wheelchair, which he thought was completely unnecessary. But so it's a fascinating story. And then, of course, once they land in Crimea, you know, the Crimea itself had been devastated with the brutal conflict between the Red Army and the Wehrmacht. And then driving over unpaved roads through the Crimean Peninsula, up over the Crimean Mountains, and then down the coast, 5 hours to get roughly 90 or 100 miles. Extraordinary journey. And apropos of the British, of course, the Russians had thrown on a lavish luncheon halfway through that journey in a mountain village called Otsushka. And Anna Roosevelt very wisely managed to finagle FDR's way out of that luncheon. Churchill, of course, went, and it was full of caviar and vodka. And I've actually, when you read the archives in Britain, they rave about the butter, believe it or not, in the Soviet Union, because you know there just was so little in wartime Britain, and the food really, the Soviets really threw on quite a feast. But the whole journey and the whole expedition is extraordinary. And of course, from the American perspective, there were three key objectives. Number one, we still have to defeat Germany. I mean, again, we tend to forget that. The war is not over yet. So how do you coordinate the final defeat of Germany? Critical thing is getting the Soviet Union to agree to a date certain to declare war on Japan once Germany is defeated. And finally, of course, for Roosevelt, the key goal is establishing the United Nations. All of these things were unsettled. You know, from the military perspective, the idea of an invasion of Japan was still on the table, and the idea that the Japanese could pull all these troops off the mainland of Asia, out of China and Manchuria to defend the home islands was a terrifying thought to General Marshall and Eisenhower and others. So, of course, getting the Soviet Union to declare war was critical as far as they were concerned, because they wanted to tie down all those Japanese troops. You know, again, I always tell my students, people forget that 4/5 of the Japanese army in the Second World War was in China. And, you know, if they were freed up to fight Americans, it would have been terrible. So that was really, really important. In fact, Admiral Leahy, who was Roosevelt's chief of staff, basically said, you know, getting the Russians to agree to that declaration of war in Japan was worth the whole trip to Yalta. Of course, when it came to the United Nations, there were two outstanding issues. They still hadn't decided yet on how many seats the Soviet Union should have in the General Assembly. Stalin wanted 16, one for each republic, and Roosevelt was dead against that. And then finally, of course, the really thorny issue of what kind of veto power they would have in the Security Council. So there again, you know, there was no guarantee that the United Nations was going to fly. So from the American perspective, those were the three objectives, and they left Yalta feeling quite good about what they had accomplished.
Well, and it sounds like it was worth the trip because of the many things that were done in relation to post-war Europe as well. Did you have any comments on the dividing up of Berlin, zones in Germany, all those kinds of things? Did you see
Yeah, I mean,
that's important?
Yeah, I mean, they had to establish zones of occupation. Of course, Yalta remains controversial because of what happened after the war. But I think it's very important to understand, and I talk about this in the book, that, you know, Churchill had flown off to Moscow to meet Stalin one-on-one in October of 1944, and they signed this famous percentages agreement where Stalin agreed that Greece could be 90% British, 10% Russian, Romania would be 90% Russian, 10% Greek. You know, they'd split Yugoslavia 50-50 and Bulgaria 75-25, so forth and so on. So, you know, the notion that Roosevelt was the only one engaged in a kind of great power negotiation over, you know, what was going to happen in Europe is really not the case. Both Churchill and Roosevelt recognized that Stalin wanted to have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Basically, what they tried to do was ameliorate the situation, but there was no expectation that Poland was going to emerge without some degree of Soviet control.
You know, the personal side of this Yalta conference is pretty interesting as well. FDR had developed a pretty good relationship with Churchill. He called Stalin Uncle Joe at this conference, didn't he? Which I don't believe Stalin really appreciated. No. So what do you see of those relationships between the big three leaders here?
Well, you know, I mean, it's fascinating. If you look at Churchill, actually spent more time with Stalin than Roosevelt. And Churchill said things like, you know, if Stalin and I could have dinner once a week, we'd get on like a house on fire. You know, he went to see him in August of '42. I mean, Churchill was tasked with the job, of course, of seeing Stalin when it was clear they weren't going to be able to open a second front in the manner and the time that they thought. So in a way, he got the short end of the stick. It's very interesting. You know, they did develop a kind of rapport, but when it came to the three of them, Stalin certainly he liked Churchill, and he sent Churchill birthday greetings for the rest of his life, even in the middle of the Cold War. They exchanged birthday greetings every year, which he didn't, by the way, with Roosevelt. But Stalin also told Roosevelt, you know, I don't trust Churchill. So I think they did develop a rapport. I think Roosevelt, of course, I think it's really important to understand that he saw Yalta as a beginning. And both at Tehran and Yalta, his primary goal was to create a bond of trust with Stalin, not because he thought Stalin was a nice guy or wasn't a brutal dictator, but because he firmly believed there could never be international peace after the war if the Soviet Union were not involved in the international community and in the United Nations. I mean, at the beginning of the book, and I often say when I'm talking about this, that Roosevelt really had three goals in the last 100 days. The first was to establish the institutions of peace, which would be the United Nations. The second was to overcome American isolationism, which he still was worried about even at the end of the war. And the third was the maintenance of great power cooperation. And I think that's the part that people have a hard time understanding. He's not alone in this. There's a wonderful quote from the chiefs of staff at the end of the book. They all recognize that Soviet power is a reality. and there's no way that they're going to be able to maintain peace after the war if the Soviet Union isn't a part of that international peace structure. And that comes directly from the chiefs of staff as well. So, again, I think that it's unfortunate what happens at Yalta and in the post-war world, but I think Roosevelt wasn't expecting to drop dead 3 months later, and I think he hoped that he would be able to sort of ameliorate the situation as it went on.
The other personal angle that I think is interesting in your book is FDR's decision to take his daughter Anna with him on this trip. Why did he do that?
Well, partly because Anna wanted to go. She was very jealous of her brothers. Her brothers are all in the military, and both Elliot and James, particularly James, had been on a lot of the summit meetings that, in Quebec and Newfoundland and so forth that Churchill and Roosevelt had held. Anna found out that Sarah Churchill, Churchill's daughter, was going to be there. And so she angled to go, which really upset Eleanor because Eleanor wanted to go. Frankly, I don't think Roosevelt wanted Eleanor to be there. He said to her, people will fuss over you. She's the first lady and so forth. Whereas Anna was Anna enjoyed this rather extraordinary position. She was in the White House and she became a kind of gatekeeper because she was very concerned about his health. She had the cabin across the hall from him on the USS Quincy and spent a lot of time really kind of protecting her father. And that continued throughout the conference itself. To a certain extent, people had to get Anna's permission to see him. And she was monitoring his physical condition very carefully.
Another interesting facet in your book examines FDR's visit with Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, and I think the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt. And he arrived aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer. This must have been extraordinary.
Yeah, unfortunately, I had to cut some of the story of the USS Murphy out of the book because it was too long. But I got carried away in the original draft because that ship was, it had the reputation of being a lucky ship. It was rammed by an oil freighter in the middle of the night and sheared off the entire bow, which went immediately to bottom, killing 214 officers and men. But the ship itself, with the watertight compartment, survived, and they actually towed it into Boston. And of course, they had the name the Murphy, so those Boston dock workers thought this was the greatest ship in the world. And they actually, they rebuilt the bow and sent it back out to sea. But no, it's this extraordinary story where the Murphy goes down to Jeddah to pick up the king of Saudi Arabia, who's never left the kingdom. And of course, the prime minister, his aide, goes on board the ship and says, well, the king can't sleep in these quarters. I mean, these are ridiculous. They were not nearly what the king should have. So they decided to build a Bedouin tent for the king on deck. And then, of course, the king has to eat, and the king wanted to feed an entire crew because, that's Arab hospitality. And he showed up with 100 sheep that he wanted to slaughter. And the captain, completely flabbergasted, finally compromised and allowed him to bring 10 sheep on board so the king would have fresh lamb on this journey. But he didn't have to feed the entire crew. But there are these extraordinary scenes, this extraordinarily colorful group of Bedouin tribesmen and the king of Saudi Arabia arriving on board, with the tent and everything on board the Murphy, pulling up alongside the USS Quincy in the Bitter Lake. And then this extraordinary meeting where Roosevelt really was convinced he could convince the king of Saudi Arabia to support the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This, of course, was a British responsibility. So Roosevelt's kind of usurping the British role here. But it's a fascinating story, and it's really the first time a U.S. president, and every president since, has tried to intervene in this Arab-Israeli conflict. And he really presses the king. He says, the Jews had suffered eviction, destruction of their home, torture, and mass murder under the Germans, and he wanted to do something to help them. He said he even felt partially responsible. But the king would hear none of it. I mean, he actually gets irritated and cuts Roosevelt off after 3 different times. Roosevelt tries different tacks. He even says the Jews are wonderful farmers. They can make the desert bloom. This could be a good thing for the Arab community and so forth. but it goes nowhere. When Roosevelt got home, to 3 or 4 people, he called it the greatest failure of his career.
Interesting.
He really felt that he had this ability to talk people into his powers of persuasion, and he made no progress whatsoever with Ibn Saud.
But didn't he get the Quincy Agreement? I'm not. That was essentially a way to establish oil.
Well, we already had the oil rights. I mean, the oil rights were already been established in Saudi Arabia, and there were agreements over air routes, and there were some commercial dimensions to this visit that Roosevelt was very much in favor of. But those were things that were worked out between the State Department, and his focus was this question of Jewish homeland in Palestine.
He had a significant trip home, and also he's going to end up reporting to Congress about this trip, and he's in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
I know you've got some thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, I make the point in the book that after this 14,000-mile journey, I write that in some ways the more extraordinary journey was the journey he took down the center aisle of the House of Representatives of Congress, because it's the first time in Roosevelt's public career that he allows himself to be wheeled down in front of this standing ovation in his wheelchair. I mean, completely unabashed. Normally what Roosevelt would do is the Secret Service would wheel him in, or he would be wheeled into a podium or whatever, and then he would stand up and lock his braces into place and hold onto the podium with his left hand. Look at every photograph of Roosevelt. You'll see him gripping a podium or something with his left hand, or he's got his arm around an aide, and he's standing up being propped up by these steel braces underneath his pant legs. But he decided he really had, at this point in his life, he really didn't want to do that anymore. He was tired of it, and so he allowed it. And it's a very moving scene because both Francis Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt responded the same way. In their diaries, they say that it was almost as if Roosevelt was finally admitting, not to the audience so much, but to himself, that Eleanor said, "You see, I am a crippled man." So it was a very, very powerful moment. And then he apologizes, of course, in the beginning of that address for his sitting posture, and says, "It's a lot easier for me to sit than to stand with 10 pounds of steel strapped around my leg." So it's a huge acknowledgement, public acknowledgement. And I went through all of his speeches, and the last time he publicly addressed his own disability that directly was 1928 when he ran for governor of the state of New York.
In comparing him to our other great commanders in chief, you think about what his legacy was. Washington finished his war. Lincoln at least was alive when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, and he even got to visit Richmond. While the Depression was behind him, FDR died before he knew that the war was over in Europe and the Pacific.
Yeah.
So how do you bring closure with that in mind to these last 100 days?
Well, it's interesting. It makes me think of the speech that Winston Churchill gave in the House of Commons when Roosevelt died. Because Churchill said, and I'll paraphrase here, I can't find it in the book without stumbling around, but Churchill says that Roosevelt, like his soldiers and sailors, died in battle harness. Sure victory. It's a very moving and powerful address. So, and it's kind of sad too, because, in spite of all of that's been written about the sort of relationship he had with Eleanor and so forth, he was looking forward to going to England. They had planned a trip to England, and he wanted Eleanor to buy new clothes, and he was very excited about this. And I think he was looking forward. And also in the book, just extraordinary conversations he has with Daisy Suckley near the end of his life, where he talks about resigning, that he would resign the presidency. And then he even speculates that maybe he would become the first Secretary General of the United Nations. So he's thinking beyond, I really feel that his whole point in life was setting up the United Nations and finishing the war. And I wouldn't, he loved being president, but he also was very tired and would complain about the official responsibilities. And I think it's conceivable he might have resigned. Not necessarily right away, but I think it's conceivable. But so in terms of closure, I mean, I think for him, the fact that they had settled the United Nations and the fact that the United Nations conference date was set up, that was closure for Franklin Roosevelt. Because at Yalta, as you recall, Stalin suddenly acquiesced in the voting procedure that was put forward by the Americans. I think it's a kind of silent, tacit quid pro quo over Poland, by the way, where the Soviet Union also reduced the demand for 16 seats down to 3. And you could make a really logical argument that the number of deaths in Ukraine and Belarus really justified those two Soviet republics being in the General Assembly. They had suffered so terribly during the war. And Roosevelt, sort of mulling that over that evening at Yalta, says to Secretary Stettinius, I think this is all right. So the big success for Roosevelt then was establishing the United Nations, putting those things behind him. And they set the date. I mean, they set the date for the opening for the conference at Yalta. It's going to be April 25th, which is pretty ambitious. Right. This again goes back to his whole thinking that it was critical not to make the mistake that Woodrow Wilson made and try to put this institution together after the war was over. They had to, as he said to Anne O'Hare McCormick near the end of his life, a New York Times reporter, they had to strike while the iron is hot. They had to get this thing up and running while the war was still on, because they still were, they had this wartime cooperation that they couldn't afford to lose.
I want to get to an excerpt from your book that I want you to comment on. But before that, we kind of need to finish this out with FDR's final trip to Warm Springs and what happens there. Any thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, it's a very moving story. We haven't talked that much about his health, but everybody had noticed by this point that he was declining. And there was a lot of concern from especially people close to him that saw him on a day-to-day basis, but even those that didn't see him, because somebody hadn't seen him for a few months and came and saw him, was struck by how thin and gaunt and he looked and how he had aged and so forth. So both the trip to Yalta, there was, on the one hand, concern that maybe that would be too tiring. On the other hand, the idea was, we'll get him out of Washington and he's on a battleship or he's away from everything. That he always had this ability to somehow bounce back. And it didn't really seem to happen in Yalta. And then the idea was, well, Warm Springs had this rejuvenative quality about it that warm Georgia sun, as you well know, would spring in Georgia with all the azaleas blooming in April would be a wonderful thing with Easter. And it's kind of interesting that it is Easter time. But he doesn't really recover. And of course, he finally succumbs on the 12th of April, 1945. And again, William Hassett, his secretary, his personal secretary, is talking to Dr. Brune, the cardiologist, who's now following Roosevelt everywhere he goes. He pulls him aside at the beginning of the trip to Warm Springs and says, "Tell me the truth. He's not going to make it, right?" And Hassett says, "Well, if he's a doctor," and he says, "Well, if he cuts his workload back to, they wanted him to work 4 hours a day, which is completely ridiculous for the president of the United States running a global war." And when Brune gets done saying that, then Hassett just says, "Well, that's it. I know he's not going to make it," because he knew that Roosevelt would never be able to cut his workload 4 hours a day. So it's a very moving end to that story, how he goes down to this place that he loves so dearly. And in a way, it's kind of befitting in some respects that he died there, because it was such a special place to him after his onset with.
So I want to read you this excerpt from your book. And I know you have a few slides you'd like to share with us as you would elaborate on this. You said, "The world we live in today is certainly not perfect, but as the American people retreat into xenophobia and nationalism and demonstrate less willingness to engage with other nations and peoples, we should reflect on the price that Franklin Roosevelt and so many hundreds of thousands of others paid to secure global peace. We should remember FDR's vision, faith, and idealism, his conviction that the world's problems are America's problems, and ask ourselves if, in the face of the challenges confronting us today, we will exhibit the same courage to live up to our international responsibilities.
Yeah, well, again, I think that what's interesting about this, and I do have a few slides, and maybe the way to do this is to talk a little bit about use the slides to illustrate this. And I'm just going to make sure that this is up.
It started, it didn't share yet.
Okay.
Okay, it's coming now. There you go.
Okay. So, as I said, Roosevelt's trying to set the world on the path to peace, and I won't go through all these slides. I love this one, though. This is a 100 Days cartoon on the right, and on my screen anyway, and on the left, he's in his wheelchair. But, when Roosevelt was trying to organize Lend-Lease and secure British aid to Great Britain at the beginning of the war, before the United States was in the war, he actually went before Congress, and it was his State of the Union address of January 1941. And, he's trying to convince Congress to support Lend-Lease. And this is where he talks about lending the British a garden hose. Your neighbor's house is on fire, you're going to loan them the garden hose, you're not going to ask them to pay for it, and so forth. But actually, the Four Freedoms comes out of a State of the Union address, where he's actually trying to get the appropriation for Lend-Lease. And in this speech, he asks this rhetorical question at the end, why should the American taxpayer and the Congress support this aid to Britain? And that's when he sort of asks that rhetorical question, and then he answers it by saying, in a future world which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded on 4 fundamental human freedoms. And then in that wonderful voice of his, the first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world, and freedom of worship, which Americans are used to because that's in our Constitution. But then he says freedom from want, freedom from poverty, and so forth. And I think, again, particularly this generation, we forget that the war had economic causes. Roosevelt said in 1944, people who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff with which dictatorships are made. And the rise of Nazism and these extreme ideologies came out of the Great Depression. It was a global economic depression. And then, of course, freedom from fear. And you need international security. So in other words, what happens in the rest of the world is important to American security. It's not just, building an isolationist America or a fortress America. We have to be engaged in the world. We have to be concerned about the well-being of people around the world, because their security and well-being is tied to the security and well-being of the United States. So he goes on then, he's worried about American isolationism coming back at the end of the war. And I think this is a really interesting example of how he worked. Of course, the opposition to the war led to the establishment of this America First Committee. People don't want to help Britain. They want to stay out of this war. We all know, of course, that the war then out on December 7th, 1941. And so now the war is underway, and he has to figure out a way to convince the American people to embrace this broader vision of American foreign policy, which includes freedom from want and freedom from fear everywhere in the world. And of course, he goes on the radio and gives his famous fireside chat in February of 1942, just about 2 months after Pearl Harbor. And he actually asked the American people to buy maps in advance of this chat. And he had maps published and so forth. And then he goes on the radio and he actually said, now take out your maps. And he said, people had to understand World War II was a different kind of war. It was different in its technology, different in its weapons, but also in its geography. It is, he said, war on every continent, every island, every sea lane, and every air lane in the world. And I'll come back to that in a second. Of course, for most Americans, the vision that they have of the United States is this continent isolated by 2 vast oceans, protected by these 2 vast oceans. This is an equatorial map of the United States. But Roosevelt also had published maps like this. He actually commissioned that show the United States location from a polar map projection. And as you can see, it's much closer to the Eurasian continent and the war in Europe than we might think. And then when you add in the air dimension, it becomes even closer still. So Roosevelt had maps like this produced in advance of this talk. So he's trying to make this point that, you know, again, the security and well-being of people everywhere is tied to the security and well-being of the people of the United States. And hence we need to support the idea of the promotion of freedom from want and freedom from fear everywhere in the world. And again, based on this projection of how close the United States is to the rest of the world. And I think it's no surprise that the symbol of the United Nations that came out of the war is a polar projection map. So I think in writing that last passage, what I was referring to was that I think what Roosevelt really felt deeply in his core was that the United States had a responsibility, an international responsibility, to think about other parts of the world and to concern itself with the well-being of people the world over. And he was hoping to see the United Nations as the primary vehicle to do that.
Well, that's a great insight. Thank you. So, Mr. Ambassador, I salute you for this wonderful conversation and for your scholarship. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. If you'd like to continue this adventure, I recommend that you visit Day by Day at the website of the FDR Presidential Library. The voyages across the Atlantic back home on the USS Quincy are worth the time spent. So go Red Foxes. I now turn it over to Amy Woods for your questions for the last few minutes. Amy.
Sure, thank you. I don't see any new ones coming in just yet online, but we did have a few that were submitted in advance. So I'm going to pull out just a few. One relates to the current situation in the country. As we find ourselves in the middle of an economic crisis with millions more unemployed in the past several weeks, are we already in another Great Depression? And as a follow-up, the government was very quick to respond by delivering aid. Do you think we would have been better off with money going to a series of New Deal type programs that help rebuild our infrastructure?
Well, that's a good question. I think a couple of things. First of all, it's hard to say if we're in another Great Depression. I think the economic consequences of this COVID-19 crisis are very dramatic, in part because it's so compressed. The Depression actually took some months, even years, to fully develop back in 1929, 30, 31. So this situation is rather unique, and one hopes that the vaccine that's coming at some point down the road and getting over this crisis will see the economy recover more quickly. Having said that, I think it is interesting that you see this massive stimulus. I mean, in a way, that is already, the government's already learned a great lesson from the Great Depression. You know, remember when Roosevelt took office, nobody had ever done this sort of thing before. There really wasn't any state. There was Bill Lechtenberg, the great historian, said the only contact the American people had with the federal government before the New Deal was to buy a stamp at the post office. And, you know, when Roosevelt comes in with Social Security, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, federal deposit insurance, you know, you name it, on and on and on. This whole kind of social safety net infrastructure that we still have was built during the New Deal. And many politicians will, you know, disagree over what level government should support the economy and so forth. But I think we're a pretty rare person that would say we shouldn't have unemployment insurance or we shouldn't have Social Security or things like that. So in a very fundamental way, we've already learned that lesson. Having said that, I think, you know, one of the things that is kind of missing today is the incredible mobilization that Roosevelt orchestrated during the Second World War. It's that mobilization that actually inspired the Defense Production Act that people are talking about that was passed in 1950 under Truman. That actually was modeled on the wartime mobilization. And I do think that the federal government probably could do more in terms of trying to ensure that the personal protective equipment and ventilators and testing kits and so forth are there. You know, Roosevelt, after Pearl Harbor, basically went to Detroit and said, okay, boys, I want you to build airplanes. In fact, I want you to build 125,000 airplanes next year, 60,000 this year, 125,000 next year. They built a 145-acre war production plant in Detroit with its own foundry. And the automobile industry did not sell any cars for the next 3 years. They turned over all the production. It was the greatest industrial concentration of any place in the world, was the American automobile sector. And for 2 years, almost 3 years, they had a stockpile of about 450,000 cars, but they didn't make a single car or truck for the next 3 years. They dedicated all of their energy to building aircraft, tanks, jeeps, you name it. It was all dedicated to the war. And after the war, of course, Detroit did very well, and so did the U.S. economy. So I think there are no real risks involved in trying to meet a crisis like this, taking federal leadership and really driving American industry forward.
Related to the same topic, another question that was sent in before the event. How do you think Eleanor Roosevelt would contribute if she were First Lady during our current national pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Eleanor Roosevelt would, as she was a major public figure. And during the war, she played a very important role rallying the troops, visiting hospitals. She made a very famous tour of the Pacific. She toured England. As a kind of compassionate figure that really tried to bring people together. A lot of people don't realize that the first person to speak to the American people after Pearl Harbor was Eleanor Roosevelt. She actually spoke the night of December 7th because she had a regularly scheduled Sunday night broadcast. And she talked about the fear and the anxiety and the fact that her 4 sons were all in the service. And she understood what people were going through, and she was going through it herself. And so I think she would play a very similar role, probably. I think it's very important for the country to stand united at this point and try to work together towards bringing this terrible health crisis to an end. I think she would have played a role there.
Okay, we have a few coming in live now. One is, where do you place FDR in an informed view of America's political views on economics? Today, he would be called a communist, but in times with a more educated reference frame, what was he really?
Roosevelt was a capitalist. I would argue that Franklin Roosevelt saved capitalism. There were lots of people in his administration in the New Deal that would have liked for him to nationalize the banks or maybe nationalize industry. Roosevelt never did that. Roosevelt tried to make capitalism work for the average American. That was his goal. And as he said, he wanted to try to mitigate the excesses of unfettered capitalism. How do you reduce the hazards and vicissitudes of life? How do you give the average American a kind of measure of economic security? Well, you do that by providing federal deposit insurance, by providing employment insurance, by providing Social Security, which were paid for out of payroll taxes. And so and if you think about what was going on at the time, there was actual talk of potential revolution in the United States. I mean, that's how bad things were. And you have the example of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and militaristic Japan. I mean, you had lots of people turning to extreme ideologies in the early 1930s. So by, telling the American people that the only thing they had to fear is fear itself, and by using the power of the federal government to try to mitigate, as I said, the worst excesses of unregulated capitalism, he actually strengthened capitalism and strengthened the financial sector and strengthened Wall Street, again, in a way that helped preserve capitalism at a very difficult moment in U.S. history.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left. Let me find another one here for you. Roosevelt's use of maps that you discussed is quite interesting. Do you think there are ways that current politicians could explain things that would help the U.S. make better decisions?
Well, it's true that people felt they really had someone who understood them in the White House. He only gave 27 fireside chats over his 12 years in office. He used them very judiciously. He would go before the public and people would gather on the radio and he would explain what the government was trying to do. And the most famous one is, of course, the one having to do with banking, because there had been all these run on the banks for years leading up to the moment of his inauguration. New York State Bank was closed. I mean, 11,000 banks across the country had gone under. About a third of all savings deposits had disappeared. People were just in a total panic. Nobody wanted their money in the bank. And he announces what? A bank holiday, right? This is a holiday, you know? And he shuts down the banks for 4 or 5, 6 days. It actually took a little longer than they thought. And then he turned to his Treasury officials, and actually working with the Truman Treasury officials, they drew up what was called the Emergency Banking Act, which was a system by which they could refinance the banks in the United States and provide, again, a measure of security for those banks. And then, you know, do a kind of survey of the banks and decide which banks are strong, which need a little help, and which ones probably shouldn't open because they were just too far gone, partly because of unregulated activity. And then he went on the radio on the 12th of March, 1933, and explained to the American people what banks are supposed to do, what their deposits are for, how the deposits are used to support industry and houses and commercial activity, et cetera. And then he said, you know, it's your problem as much as it is mine, but together we cannot fail. And the same people that were, you know, lining up to take their money out of the banks a week earlier now lined up to put their money back in. And so I think he had this extraordinary quality about him that was very reassuring to the American people. And I think that's something that, you know, is a very important role that the president is supposed to play. You know, our president is not just the head of government; he's also, or she is also, the head of state. And in that capacity, part of what they need to do is to reassure the American people in a moment of great crisis. And I think Roosevelt would spend a good deal of time trying to do that right now.
Well, I'm going to end on that note, as it's exactly 5 p.m. Eastern time. Although I know we probably have some folks on the West Coast, but with respect to everyone's time, we're going to wrap it up now. I'd like to thank Dr. David Woolner and Colonel Jim Johnson for spending time with us in this intriguing conversation. A recording of this entire presentation will be available within a few days on our website. I will post in just a second the link to that site. We will also email it out to you as an attendee. And we've also will share with you the page of all other upcoming virtual events that we have scheduled, which some of the others you may be interested in. But thank you once again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.